Hey everyone, I'm John from photolisticlife.com, and you're watching my post-processing workflow, basically just to pull out the most potential from your landscape photographs. I'm also going to touch a little bit on composition as we go through. So let's just jump right into it because this is about the fifth time I've done this. I am not going to edit these videos just for time's sake, so there will be mistakes and you will love them. Anyways, the first thing I did was I enabled profile correction. I removed any chromatic aberration, which I don't know if there was any, but just knee-jerk, I hit that. Auto for the horizon. One of the first things you'll notice is my horizon is right in the middle, which typically breaks a lot of people's rules. However, I don't really subscribe to a lot of the rules. Most people tell you you want to have that horizon somewhere along the thirds. So either up in this area here or down here with an emphasis either on the sky and mountain or on your foreground. However, I really like the foreground in this scene, and I also wanted to grab these mountains to give some perspective and to really, capture that, the essence of where I was. This photograph was taken in Kauai, Hawaii on my honeymoon last year. I used the Nikon DF with the Nikon 16 by 35 millimeter lens. One of my favorite combinations for landscape photography. However, I did recently switch to the Nikon D810 to future-proof my photographs. I needed a higher resolution to be able to print larger, as that's what the clients have been requesting. So I digress. Anyway, so that's taken care of. The next thing that we want to do is we want to pull out the exposure in this photograph. And just so you know, what we're striving for is if you look after it's done being edited, it's going to look like this. So it's quite different from obviously this. And that's the same photograph. The lens that I'm using, or not the lens, the camera I'm using with the sensor is just phenomenal for dynamic range. So I'm able to pull all that detail from the areas over here in the shadows, and I'm able to recover a lot of the color over here from the highlights. And you can't do that with every camera out there. There's a lot of cameras out there. For instance, my Leica, it's a M260 something. It's one of the newest ones that's out. Does not have a dynamic range that can touch this. And I would even say it struggles to touch the X100T, which is pretty phenomenal for a smaller sensor camera. But again, I digress. So let's get into this. So we're going to pull the shadows up 100%. We're going to take the highlights down 100%. And what that does is that pulls out that color that is over here in the highlights, and obviously it pulls out the detail that is over here in the shadows. When you do that with a camera that is perhaps crop sensor, micro four thirds, things like that, depending on the amount of stops that you need to recover, you'll get a lot of grain in here. With the Nikon, I find that with this, I didn't get any grain in there. And actually, if I'm gonna pull this exposure up a little bit more, so probably somewhere around 0.65. The slight blurring you see over here is actually because the wind was very, very, very windy. I don't know, very hard, very fast. And I was using a tripod, but even with that, I still got a little bit of camera shake from the wind. And I used mirror lockup with this, like I do with almost all of my landscape photography when time allows it. So the next thing we're going to do is sharpen this a little bit. So we're going to take that up to 77, which we can get some of that detail. But you see when I did that, I also got a little bit of grain in here, or at least emphasized some of that. And I mean, I don't mind that. I think it looks pretty good. But I am going to take that out a little bit. So I'm going to increase my, or I guess decrease my noise, slide that over for luminance, and that takes care of some of that. Another thing you can do is masking. If you press and hold Option and press and hold masking and then slide that over, whatever is turning black is not being sharpened. I like to do that because it takes the sharpening away from some of that grain that was there, and you can see that grain's pretty much all gone now. So I'm going to zoom back out. This shot was 25 seconds, f/16, 16 millimeters. You could go wider, but you do start to get some perspective changes, almost like fisheye. And again, another reason why you would keep the horizon pretty flat like this is because, the more you move a wide angle lens down or up from your horizon, you do start to get things that look like they're bending from that perspective or parallax. That's another reason why you would do that. So we've got the exposure pretty much where we want it. The next thing I like to do is I'm going to go ahead and move my whites over. I'm not going to press and hold Option and do this. A lot of people will do that, and actually I'll show you what that looks like. If I press and hold Options or Option, and I do that, a lot of people will go until they see that red. And what that means is you have, you've blown the highlight right there. It's completely white. And a lot of people recommend that you do that to get complete white, and they'll tell you to go over to blacks and do the same thing until you get complete black. I don't subscribe to that. I mean, I really just I go until it looks good, and I would recommend you do the same. Sometimes I'll blow those whites out all the way, depending on the photograph and the scene. And I think it's important that you do that based on the image that you take. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to punch up that clarity. I'm going to go up to about 33, 33 to 40. That's usually where I land. If you go too far, it starts to look like a HDR image or high dynamic range image, which for this, it's not too bad. But when you do that, you do start to get some ghosting around hard lines like this, especially where there's similar colors like a gray and a black. I don't like that. So I'm going to pull that back off. I'm going to go to about 30. Let's see here. About 38. Vibrance or saturation. A lot of folks really overdo it on saturation, especially if you spend a lot of time on Flickr or Google Images or something like that. It's really something that sets apart, professional photographers from amateur photographers. Is just the overkill. Used to be if you did adjust your saturation, you would adjust it and then sort of back off just because usually you would have gone too far even if you didn't know it, because it does, sometimes it looks good. I think it looks like crap. I think that this is way too green. This looks fake. This is way too green over here. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of the saturation. I don't touch saturation, very rarely would I. Vibrance, I will use that. That brings back the blues. It punches up those greens a little bit. It gives me a little more color over here. I'm not real worried about this color over here. I'm actually going to bring that in with a brush, which we'll do next. So I've already got it set where I want it. Exposure though, I'm going to leave that at 0. I really just want to get some of that color. So I've got my temperature increased, and I've got my tint or magenta is increased. So I'm going to reduce that little circle, and you'll see it's not going to put a ton of color in here. And I'm going to color in here just where that white is. A lot of landscape photography, if you're not using a graduated neutral density filter, you'll find that a lot of that landscape photography will have this area, especially during sunset and sunrise, where you're going to have just sort of a whitish area, and it breaks up that the blue of the sky and whatever your foreground is. So I like to fill that in a little bit. It is more true to what it looked like when I took the photograph, and that's kind of what I strive for, is I want to get it back to what my eyes saw, because as you know, your camera is not going to record what your eyes saw. It just does not have the dynamic range to do so. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there. And just so you can see, there's a little button down here. If you toggle this, it'll actually turn that adjustment off. And I just want you to see how little of an adjustment I did. So I'm going to go ahead and toggle that off. And I mean, you shouldn't be able to tell hardly at all. You can really see it sort of in this area right here. I'm going to do that one more time. So I'm going to toggle it off, give it a second. You see where it disappears right there. And when I toggle it back on, it comes back in. So very subtle. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that brush off. So we've got our colors where we want them. We've got the trees where, the greens where we want them. I'm going to leave the people here. I'm not going over to Photoshop. I'm not going to take anything out. I like that. I like to have the human element there, and it also sort of lends itself to giving perspective to the size of the mountain here, and it gives the image some depth, I think. One of the next things I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and take a neutral density filter. I did not use a graduated neutral density filter for this. Sometimes I will, but I was using I did use a neutral density. I did use a neutral density. I didn't use a graduated neutral density. Sometimes I'll stack them, and I'll do that, but I get a lot of, I can't think of the word right now, vignetting from stacking two filters, even though they're very thin. But when you're shooting at 16 millimeters, I don't know, I get it. So I didn't do that. I'm going to go ahead and add it now, though. So I'm just going to add a small one here. I'm not going to get too crazy. Let's see, something like that. I'm going to go ahead and reduce my exposure slightly. I don't like that. So just back off a little bit. Yeah, something like that right there. Make that a little bit bigger. I like that. I just might adjust it a bit. Okay, so I'm gonna leave that there. One of the things I didn't do that I always do is I get rid of these spots. I have dust on my sensor. I haven't cleaned it in a while. It's really, really simple to do. You just take the clone tool right here and you come down to visualize spots like that. And you can see I've got quite a few on here. I will not make you sit through this while I do that. Otherwise, I will bore the crap out of you. So let's go ahead and stop doing that. There we go. All right. So we've got the photo close to what we want. And if you remember, this is what we're striving for. So you can see there's a lot more color there, and we need to get that. So I'm going to show you how to do that. So we come back. It looks pretty good so far. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're actually going to take another brush and we're going to punch up the exposure. I'm going to start with 46 just so I can see it, and then I'll adjust from there. I'm going to come over here where the waves we're hitting. That's where this white is. I want that to stand out a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and color that in just a bit. Okay, so I might even punch it up a little bit more. Let's see what this looks like. 62. Yeah, I like that. I'm gonna leave it right there. Then I'm gonna take a radial filter, and I kind of cheated because I tried this with a brush and I did not like the way it looked. So I'm gonna use a radial filter to do this. But with images, you know, I talk about composition and giving the image depth. Another way you can give it image depth is with light. And you know, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about dodging and burning a photograph. Very few people do it well. It's tough to do with any photo. Even myself, I have trouble with dodging and burning, and really visualizing where I want to do that. But once you get the hang of it, you can really give these images a lot of depth. So I'm going to go ahead and draw one here. I'm going to draw it fairly large. And what I'm doing is I'm going to give this image the reflection on the water that it had. The sun dropped over on the right hand side here, and as it did, it had light reflecting off of this, which you can faintly see, but you can't see it. It's just not as detailed as what it was, or as colorful as what it was. So all I'm doing is I'm doing a radial filter here. I'm going to increase the exposure very, very slightly, so about 30, and that gives us the light. Then I'm going to go ahead and increase the temperature, and that gives us some of the color, and then magenta gives us a little more color. So kind of matches up with the sky that we have there. And then I'm going to play with it. I'm going to move it around a little bit until I figure out where I want it. I might even make it a little bit bigger. Yeah, I think I like that. All right, so I'm going to leave that right there. I'll close that down. And I think that about does it. You can play around with the neutral density filter, obviously. I mean, you can play around with all of this stuff to your taste. You can drop that exposure maybe just a little bit more, and then pull it down just a bit. Yeah, like that. Close that off. There we go. So I like that. So that's pretty dang close to the other one over here. I think the exposure, I had it up 65 versus the 45 that this one is. So, or I'm sorry, this is up 45. The one we just did is up 65 on the exposure over here. So this one's just a little bit brighter, which I kind of like that. So I'm going to leave it like that. But before I let you go, I just want to show you something real quick. If you head over to photolisticlife.com, which you either found this video on YouTube or Photolistic Life, and if you go to our homepage right here, you can go down about a third of the way and subscribe to photolisticlife.com. You're not going to get any kind of spam emails or anything like that. You're just going to get an alert whenever whenever a new article is completed. It'll come to your email, and then you can just click through that way, so you don't have to keep checking back at Photolistic Life. Portfolio was just updated, so if you've been following Photolistic Life for a while and you wonder why there haven't been a lot of articles like in the past, you'll see under Abstract Fine Art, I've updated that with the most recent project that I completed, which was in a historic building in Pittsburgh called the Union Trust Building. In that building, I created these panoramic images that are 34 feet long by 10 feet high. There are 14, I think, total in there, but you can see a few of those that were done. You can see some of the other stuff that I've worked on here just recently, and then you can go back into the portfolio, and I think there's some street photography stuff that I've updated in there. I'm currently working on a project in Boston, so definitely subscribe to the website, and hopefully I will do another one of these videos here soon, and you can check that out. Thanks for watching.